those, and we're going to share those as well. So don't be shy in doing that. We want to encourage participation at home as well as here in the room. And if you're here in the room, make comments the old-fashioned way by responding, please. Yes. Okay. All right. So again, if you're joining us online, encourage you to make comments and respond to the questions so that we will include those in our class this morning. Kendall's going to be monitoring those, and we'll be able to share those with you. All right. Before we begin, let's go to God in prayer. Our Father, we thank you for your goodness and your mercy. We thank you, Father, for the ability to gather together to study from your word and to do so freely. Father, we thank you that we have a book like the book of Esther that we can look at that helps us understand a little bit more about how you work, Father, and about how your people were involved in moving forward the plans that you ultimately have for all of us, which is our salvation through Jesus Christ. Father, thank you for the love you've shown us. We pray all these things in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so as I said, we're in the book of Esther, and last week we looked at chapter 1, and we did a little bit of introduction before that. So let's just see how good your knowledge of where we are so far is. So what significant events have happened so far in the book of Esther?
We've thrown a really, really long party.
Okay, really big party.
The queen was responsible.
Yes. So at the big party, the king had said, well, hey, Queen Vashti, I want you to come and, we're all drunk. Why don't you come and present yourself before all these guys? And she refused to do so. She refused his command. And so what resulted was a decree, an edict, as you would, because the men were all concerned that other women would get crazy ideas and start to talk back to their husbands and who knows what else. But anyway, so she ended up being banned from his presence by decree, all right? And that's important as we look into chapter 2 because that's going to be kind of what begins all this. What was the other thing, not so much that's in the chapter, but that Mike talked about, the other big events that were happening for this king during this time period?
He was trying to conquer Greece.
Exactly. He was trying to conquer Greece, and so he had amassed a huge army and a huge navy and traveled all the way to Greece. And if you remember the map, that's quite far from the city of Susa. So it would have been, a major campaign. It would have taken a couple of years, maybe, to go and come back. But he was defeated soundly by much smaller numbers. The Greeks were feisty, and so he returned thoroughly defeated. Both his army and his navy suffered great defeats in those battles. So those are all the things that have kind of led up to what we're going to see in chapter 2. So with that being said, why don't we go ahead and get right into the text. So we're going to start by reading the first 4 verses of Esther chapter 2. Do I have a volunteer who'd be willing to read that out loud for us? Al? Okay.
Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel at Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given them. Then let the young women who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it.
Okay. All right. So the reason we looked at those other things that had happened beforehand, because this chapter starts with after these things, right? So after all those things that we discussed, now we're to this point. And the king is thinking about Vashti. All right? He's thinking about her. Maybe he is regretting kind of the drunken, hasty decision he made to ban her from his presence. If she had had children, he might be missing seeing them. It's a shared custody situation. Who knows? I don't know. But at any rate, he's thinking about her. And so we get these advisors come up with a plan. What are the advisors trying to do?
Replace Vashti.
Okay. I mean, on the surface, it looks like they're trying to replace Vashti, right?
For the father, they went out to find fathers who would bring their virgins to.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and this, they don't just do this in a little way, do they? They're like, okay, we're going to go over the entire empire, essentially, of Persia, which, when we saw in the week 1, was that huge map that went from India all the way over to Egypt and up to Greece, no further, but up to Greece. So it's a wide area that they're going to search for these young women. And it seems like they're trying to make sure that the king doesn't go back on his previous decree. Maybe they're concerned that if Vashti were to return to the palace, that there might be some repercussions for them. These might be some of the same advisors who had advised him to ban her in the first place. Who knows? But they're trying to appease the king with this incredible beauty contest. Let me ask this question. If you were a beautiful young virgin, what would your feelings have been when you heard of this plan? I'm sorry, what? Say again?
I would think it would depend if you're maybe in Esther's position where you've been brought up in the Jewish tradition, that might not sound so good. If you were just a poor commoner who happened to be beautiful, and that could really raise your family status. So it depends on where you're coming from.
Okay, yeah. There could be mixed responses to this. There could be some who look at it as an opportunity. Hey, I could win that contest. I'm beautiful. I'll show them. I'll be the queen. So there may be some who are thinking very positively about it, but there may be others who are in good situations who maybe don't want to be part of that.
And a lot were not willing participants. They didn't, I'm sure there were some that didn't want to go.
Well, sure, yeah. There were probably some that didn't want to. That might have made them fearful to realize that they might be taken away from their family, from what they know. If they're from far away, they could be taken away from a homeland into a strange new place. I'm sure there were a lot of mixed thoughts about this decree. And it wasn't like you could choose, right? It wasn't like you could say, oh, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to pass on participating in that contest.
I think it was based on, did Daddy say I had to get power, or did I do it because I wanted to?
Could be, yeah. It could be parents would be pushing.
So women were nothing at that particular time.
That's what this is kind of showing, isn't it? That
They were slaves to even their own families.
Right. It's not so much that they're thinking, well, we're going to do something nice for all these women. Maybe some of the guys were justifying it in their mind that way, but in reality, this was mainly for the king, right?
It almost reminds me of the Hunger Games.
Yes.
It's either a great opportunity or it's not.
Exactly, yeah. If you've seen the movie The Hunger Games, each province or whatever would send a couple of participants every year to do battle, and whoever won, that was good for your province, but it was battles to the death, right? So it wasn't a good opportunity for most of the participants, only for that of the one who wins, right? And as we read, I think we'll see that's kind of the same situation for all these young ladies.
Well, these were also spoils of conquest. So you're thinking about this also. You're bringing every, not only
money and jewels and all the other benefits from the conquest to the king, but you're also bringing beautiful, beautiful women. So this basically is, still political.
Yes.
It's still political. It's subjugating people as well as paying honor to a king. There's a whole lot of, and that perhaps was why they didn't localize it, but they made everybody participate.
Right. Yeah, when you think about it, if you've got a daughter that has been taken into this situation, you're likely to not make a lot of fuss because you don't want to do anything that might jeopardize her in her situation. So yeah, you're right. It's a way of keeping the people down, right? Keeping the people subjected to you. Yeah, interesting thought there. All right, let's read a little bit further then. Now we're looking at, still in chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. We're going to be introduced to Mordecai here. So who would like to read that? Verses 5 through 7. All right.
Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is, Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter.
Okay, thank you. So we're introduced to Mordecai, and right away we're told a little bit about his genealogy, right? We read Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. Okay? What can we say about who Mordecai is based on this genealogy? Jeannie?
Jewish.
He is Jewish, okay? And in fact, the text is very clear to tell us that. So we understand that he's from the people of Israel. What else?
He's a relation to Saul.
Yes. Kish is mentioned here. What other famous Israelite do we associate with the name Kish? It's Saul, okay? And it appears that he is in that family line. In fact, there's a more detailed genealogy of Mordecai that appears in a couple of places. One, you remember in week 1 we talked about how there is an extended version of Esther that appears in the Apocrypha, in the books that are in the Catholic Bible. Well, in that version, but also on the tomb, there's a tomb that is traditionally ascribed to be that of Mordecai and Esther. And on that tomb, this is also inscribed, Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Shemida, son of Banah, son of Elah, son of Micah, son of Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, son of Kish. And it makes some sense because you remember a lot of Saul's family were killed in the events of 1st and 2nd Samuel. But remember, David gave grace and mercy to Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that he is a descendant of Mephibosheth, and therefore directly a descendant of Saul, King Saul. And I think the reason that we have that genealogy of Mordecai in here is going to be revealed later on. We won't reveal too much now because it's going to become more important when we're introduced later on to Haman. All right, but for now, it's just important to know that he is associated with Saul and descendants of the Benjamites, and so therefore someone from an important line in the ancestry of Israel. Okay, so that's his genealogy. We should say a word about his age because we need to kind of make this clear. So, in what we read earlier, the way it was worded, it said there was a Jew, his name was Mordecai, son of all these people, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah. And so the question is, was Mordecai himself one of those carried away from Jerusalem, or was it simply one of his ancestors? And it's important to know that the king that is mentioned here that was carried away, that occurred about 597 BC, okay? Which, if Mordecai was carried away at that time, he would now be over 100 years old in the events of Esther, okay?
My translation reads his family, and puts the asterisk to it, and then also goes down to say he. So it tells that he gives the chronological sequence a little bit clearer.
Right, yeah. And I actually put a chart up. I don't know if this is going to be very easy to see, but essentially, here's Nebuchadnezzar right here, 597. That's the deportation that is referred to here, kind of the second taking of people from Jerusalem to Babylon. The events of Esther are way over here in the 480, 485 time frame. So, again, 120 some years. I don't think, based on the activity we're seeing from Mordecai, I don't think he's that old. I think what we're meant to understand is that his family, his grandfather or somebody, was carried away from Jerusalem, and that he himself was born in exile. I think we can make that assumption. You know, if you wanted to go with him being old, I mean, we've had other old people in the Bible who've done amazing things like Abraham, but by the time we get to this point in history, people aren't living as long as they did back then. So I think he's probably younger. It would be tough for a 120-year-old guy to be raising a young daughter. So just all the evidence kind of points to him being younger than that. So, yeah. Either way, it doesn't affect our story that much, but it's just something important, I think, to think about. All right, now before we move on, let's also talk about Esther. Kendall, were we getting anything to share online? Okay.
Yeah.
Again, if you're watching online and want to share some information or thoughts or answer a question, please feel free to do so, and we'll give you a shout out right here in the class. So, in what we've read so far about Esther, we were just introduced to Esther. What do we know about her?
She's a cousin of Mordecai.
Right, she's a cousin. So his uncle was her father. She's his cousin, but he is much older than her, right?
She meets the qualifications.
Meets the qualification because she is good looking, right? She is described as a beautiful young woman, okay? So as far as the contest is concerned, she's eligible for it. What's that?
She's an orphan.
She is an orphan, yes. Yes, both her parents have died, and so she is an orphan. So for someone like that, again, this contest could be considered a positive thing. She probably doesn't have too many options as an orphan, although she is under the care of her cousin, and so, I'm sure he would be looking amongst their own people to find a suitable husband for her. But she is an orphan, and as we mentioned, she is cousin to Mordecai as well. So far, that's really all we know about her. We're going to learn more about her as we continue reading. So let's go ahead and do that then. Let's read now. Let's pick it up in verse 8. Read verses 8 through 11. All right, needing another volunteer. Keith, all right.
When the king's order and the executive had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants,
Okay, so we're learning a little bit more about Esther. We see that she's finding favor with Haggai, the eunuch in charge of all the young women. So how was it that she was able to receive this special treatment from Haggai? I mean, what was happening that caused him to pay attention to her?
She was beautiful and had a good figure.
All right, she was beautiful, and so he noticed that about her. Being a eunuch, it might not have been as important to him, but, at any rate, he could tell that she was physically had all the qualities, yeah.
I think God had his hand on this, very for sure, because how many beautiful women were brought into the palace?
Right.
So it was definitely God's hand.
Yeah, I mean, she would have been, who knows how many. I mean, I don't know if it says specifically how many, but if it's from all over, all the provinces, it could be hundreds, maybe thousands. I don't know exactly how many, but for her to be noticed amongst that crowd, I think there's definitely the hand of God there. Any other thoughts?
She hid her nationality or wherever she came from.
She did. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. I don't know how much that impacted Haggai, except maybe it kept him from being prejudiced against her. We don't know what the prevailing thought about Jewish people would have been amongst the Persians, but perhaps by not revealing who she was, that kept the people in charge from having any sort of automatic disqualification, if you know what I mean. So, yeah. So you notice that when she was taken in, it says in verse 9, the young woman pleased him and won his favor. Okay? So she was doing some things that made Haggai look positively upon her. When you think about it, the Bible has more than one hero, person who would be put into a tough situation, but would handle it kind of in this same way. Who do we think of?
Joseph.
We think of Joseph probably as the most predominant one, right? Sold into slavery into Egypt, right? But yet immediately began to earn the favor of his master because he was doing the right things. He was doing good things for him. Later on, when he was put into prison, began to earn the favor of the captain of the prison because he was doing good things. He was doing the right things, right? So it's interesting. Esther is following that same pattern. Even though she's been brought into a situation which may not be ideal, she's making the best of it, isn't she? And she's trying to live.
Take in Daniel too.
Daniel's another great example. Yes.
Head of everything.
Yes. Yes.
He was a Jew.
And even when there was, when they were saying, oh, well, you can't pray to your God anymore, or you'll be thrown in the lion's den, that didn't stop Daniel. He continued to do the right things, and God blessed him in that, just as he blessed Joseph. Now he's blessing Esther. So there's, I think, an important lesson for us.
I think that's partly why the Jewish line was not told.
Okay.
Because of the resentment of the Jews at that time.
Sure. And even though there were some prominent Jews who had success in the kingdom, like Daniel, his name would have been known amongst these Persians because he also served both the Babylonian and Persian king. But again, there might have still been some underlying hostility towards the Jewish people. Yeah. But you see Esther doing the right thing in this situation, and so I think there's an important lesson for us in that, if we're striving to do God's will, even if we're in a tough maybe job situation where our bosses are not godly or whatever, if we do the right things, God will work with us and God will bless us in that. And just as Esther is being blessed here. Okay. Let's think a little bit about Esther and Mordecai. We kind of already talked about this. Why do you suppose Mordecai wanted Esther to keep quiet about who she was? We kind of speculated about that, right? It looks as if maybe he was concerned that she would be judged negatively because of her heritage. So
Maybe he already knew who Haggai was.
yeah, right.
What-
Yeah,
what his opinion
or Haman. We're going to meet Haman in the next chapter, and a little foreshadowing. He's going to be someone who is opposed to Mordecai and to the Jews. So yeah, Mordecai might have already been aware of the kind of the current climate, that that maybe there was a negative thought about Jewish people, and so he asked her to keep quiet. What can we say about the relationship between Esther and Mordecai based on what we have seen in this chapter so far?
Obviously, he loved and cared for her and wanted to protect her.
Yes. Loved her, cared for her, willing to protect her. We see him walking daily by the courtyard to try to hear any news of how she's doing, right? He's putting himself out there because even though she's now in the palace and he's away from her, he's still concerned about her. What else? What else do we see?
I think she respected him.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, she would have told everyone who she was, where she was from, and
Right.
very humble as well.
Yeah, she was very obedient to Mordecai. And even though that wasn't her dad, but he had raised her and had become like a father to her, I'm sure. And she gave him the respect and honor that was due him. Okay. Any other thoughts about Esther and Mordecai? Okay. Well, now we're going to pause for a minute, and the text is going to give us a description of the process, what I'm calling rules of the harem, okay? So, beginning in verse 12, Esther 2, beginning in verse 12, it says this. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shazgaz, who knows, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. Okay, so there's a process that all of these women were going through. These are the women that all were gathered from this beauty contest. And it says that they took up to a year to go through a series of beauty treatments and so forth. And then that would lead up to the night in which they would go into the king. And then after that, they would then be moved from the original harem now to the group of women who are called concubines. Okay? Now, when we read something like this in the Bible, we might be inclined to say, well, is God somehow giving approval to this because it's in the Bible? And that's not the case, right? Whenever we read something in the Bible that we know is in opposition to what God's plan for his people is, then we can assume that is something that is wrong. So this is a process in which this man, the king, because of his power, has taken to an extreme, his basically desire to fulfill his own sexual fantasies or whatever, right? So he's gathering all these women, having one-night stands with them, and then they are being placed in a group of women who might never see the king again, might never have any other opportunity but to live there in that second harem with the concubines. All right, so just so we understand that this is not a godly process that we're seeing here. Yeah.
A lot of times we read in the Bible about how many times God uses an evil person
Right.
to later reveal what his plan actually is.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what we're going to see in Esther, right? We're going to see God working within what these men have thought up, but it's going to be ultimately for the good of his people and ultimately for the plan of salvation through Jesus, right? So, but we're seeing some patient preparation. What are your thoughts? Why do you think the preparations were so long and involved for the young women? 12 months.
These were naive women. They were brought into a palace. They had to have some understanding of the customs and what was expected of them. And, I mean, there's so many reasons why that time would be allowed. Basically, it's just training.
Yeah. It's kind of getting them used to the idea that this is what's going to happen. Can you imagine if they were like, okay, one day you're brought into this harem, and a week later you're brought into the king? I mean, that would be very hard. So, kind of setting.
Probably wouldn't please the king either.
Yeah. So trying
It wasn't for the women's
to pace it out. Yeah, it's for the king's sake. Yeah. So, Chris?
There's also the potential that they were quite young. This gives them the opportunity to get a little older.
Get a little bit older. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think it levels the playing field.
Right.
So they all are there for 12 months, and they're all going through this regime. They come from many different backgrounds, many different hobbies, all of that stuff. It levels the playing field so they all have a chance.
Right. Yeah, they're all getting the same beauty treatments. The oil of myrrh, apparently something very important, so who knows?
Also, it was a sorting situation as well.
Okay.
Because Esther got 7 maids in a preferred place. So, I mean, it was also figuring out who goes first, who goes second, and it was, a sorting.
Yeah, and it may have been that Haggai, as he would be able to, from experience, be able to say, okay, these are the ones that I think will have the best chance with the king. So he was probably sorting them out. I think you're right. Yeah.
That's also his job.
Yeah.
I mean, he was in a good place.
Indeed. Al?
At this time, how old was the king?
I don't know that we know exactly. I think he's probably at least 20 years older than Esther, I would think. I don't know. I'm just guessing, but we don't know exactly how old he was. Still able to enjoy the ladies, so not super.
Tells us a lot about the king.
What's that?
I said the whole story tells us a lot about the king.
Right.
He's very shallow.
Really? Yeah, when it comes to relationships, yeah. So far, he's not shown that he understands really, what it takes to be married to a person. Yeah. So, okay. We kind of already said this. Who benefited from this process? The king, mainly. I mean, he got to have a different woman every night. That was what he wanted. Some of the women, I guess you could say they benefited because maybe they're in a better situation living-wise than they were taken from, but ultimately, it's not much of a life for them.
I think it's kind of like speed dating.
Yes.
You meet this person, okay, you either connect with them or you don't. So, and then you just keep going. He's got a lot of people that he's got to get to find his soulmate.
Yeah.
So if we think of it as just having a coffee with somebody and seeing if you even kind of connect.
Right.
I mean, they have one shot.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Make an impression.
You're right. They've got one shot. Yeah.
I'm sure the king's servants who were in charge of all this, they're trying to do their best for him to move up in the kingdom or get better positions or whatever too. So
Right. Yeah. They want to keep on his the servants want to keep on his good side, so they're going to work as hard as they can to present the best of these young ladies.
Well, if he saw that was the most, if Esther was, if he could understand that Esther was most likely to be chosen, then he was the intimate of Esther as well. In other words, he stood high in court.
Sure, yeah, and if she were to become queen, that would boost his position as well. Yeah.
According to the Google, which lists some reasonable facts.
Okay.
He would have been 40 years old when he married Esther.
Okay. Yeah, so I think we're about 20, 25 years old. I don't know how old she would have been, but she probably might have been no more than a teen. And did the Google tell us anything there? We're kind of speculating, but you know, the young ladies, when they became eligible for marriage, were often still in their teens. So, and we already talked about this. What typically happened to the women once they'd seen the king? They were moved into another part of the harem, and basically at that point, unless they got called back, they wouldn't see him again. And so it would be a life after that of just hanging out with all these other women. Maybe they become servants within the palace, who knows, right? So again, it's not meant to be necessarily of benefit to the young ladies. It's definitely more for the sake of the king. Okay. All right, now let's read verses 15 through 18, because now we're going to specifically read about Esther's turn to visit the king. Who would like to read that? 15 through 18. Jeannie? Okay.
When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. When Esther was taken to the king Ahasuerus into his holy palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all of his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with moral generosity.
All right, good things have happened here. Huh? Esther becomes queen. So, from what we just read, what qualities did Esther show that helped her to become queen?
Her beauty.
Her beauty is there, of course, yeah. She was always beautiful, made even more so by the treatments, probably.
She won favor from all who met her.
Yeah, she treated everybody with kindness, right? Obviously. No one ever had anything negative to say about her in the time that she had been there in the harem. And even the king sees that in the way that she encounters with him.
Mine says also she accepted the advice of Haggai, and so in other words, she was smart enough to know that he was acting in her behalf.
Right. Yeah. There was this whole thing where they said you can take something with you into the king. I assume that's meant to be like a gift to present to the king, maybe. Who knows? We don't know exactly what it was. But she asked his advice about that. He said, oh, this is what I think you should take with you. And whatever it was part of pleasing the king. So yeah, she was humble and was willing to take advice. And you know, someone who's been gifted with natural beauty and good looks, humility sometimes doesn't go with that, does it? Right? I mean, sometimes someone who's exceptionally good looking tends to get proud, right? And saying, you know, Why do I need to care what other people think? I've got it all, you know. But she wasn't like that, was she? She was humble. You could tell that Mordecai had brought her up to be humble, that she was willing to take advice from others. And as we said, she's finding favor with everybody. Everybody's pleased with her, which is good. What evidence do we see from the king, Ahasuerus or Xerxes, depending on your version, that shows that he is really pleased with Esther? A big party. It's her party. Esther's feast.
Gives her the crown.
Gives her the crown, yes. And it almost implies that same night he made that decision. I don't know if that's really true or not, but he didn't go any further in his search. He said, "Oh, she's the one. I'm putting the crown on her. I've made you queen." And he's really so pleased with himself that what else does he do? Makes it a holiday. He's giving everybody a tax cut. You know, he's just doing all sorts of wonderful things, isn't he? All the peoples are benefited from this encounter he's had with Esther, right? And you get the sense that it's the end of a long kind of period of him being not really happy, not really satisfied. You know, I think ever since the banning of Vashti, he's kind of been just kind of, not content. And then suddenly, and that's interesting because he's had plenty of women, but he hasn't found, that hasn't brought him contentment. But now suddenly, here comes Esther. He's probably saying, "You complete me." So, I don't know. All right, and here's the question we're going to ask time and again. Chance, Esther's skill, or hand of God? Hand of God. Along with Esther being who she is. So God can use anybody in any situation, but he's chosen Esther for this role because she's humble, because she's gracious to people, because she has those qualities. He's chosen her. You think about, reminds me a little bit of Mary, right? God chose Mary to be the mother of Jesus for a reason, right? Because he knew that she had similar qualities, that she would raise him in the right way. So you see what I mean? So God looks for good qualities in us and chooses us to fill a role based on that. Same thing with Joseph, like we talked about, or Daniel.
But the flip side is she was a willing instrument of God.
Yes.
So he can choose someone and they can not be an instrument.
Exactly.
Or they can be, in her case, because of her humility and who she was and her training, she wanted to be.
Right. And just to be clear, we're not saying that, okay, one's good, one's behavior leads you to salvation, but it's one's behavior allows you to be used by God to influence others. And that's what we've seen from Esther, right? Okay. All right, let's go ahead. We're going to read the last section real quick here. This part of the story, this next little section almost seems like it's an aside, but it's an important part of our story that it will build on later. So we see that in the final verses 19 through 23, we return to a little story of Mordecai. So it says, "Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. All right, so Mordecai foils a plot. Why is he sitting at the king's gate? What does that tell? All right, one, yeah, he maybe wanted to be near Esther and kind of listen for news of her.
Well, he could become a palace official because she had become queen.
Okay, yeah, so he benefited from that. I would assume anybody sitting at the gate would have been someone who had some business in the administration of the government there, right? So he had a role of some kind that made him someone who could sit at the king's gate. Those who sat there probably were just kind of waiting to see if the king wanted them for some particular reason to help with whatever, So he's there at the gate. What do we see about Mordecai's character based on this story? He was protected, yeah.
And he was true to the king.
True to the king, yeah. He didn't just hear about the plot and do nothing, right? Sometimes we say, I don't want to get involved, right? That wasn't Mordecai. He got involved. He heard about this plot, and he said, I need to do something about it, right? Even though, as a Jew, he maybe didn't necessarily owe any allegiance to the king, but I think for Esther's sake, maybe, he wanted to do that. And his process, he worked through Esther to make sure the king was aware of it. Again, chance, Mordecai's skill, or hand of God. I think, again, we see a little bit of Mordecai's character, but also I think we see God working here. Because later in the story, the fact that this happened will become extremely important to what happens to our heroes. So
it is interesting that it specifically says that she presented the information in the name of Mordecai.
Yes.
So that the king knew where it came from.
And they were very it was significant too that they made sure they recorded it in the Chronicles that Mordecai had helped thwart this plot. All right. So this was a good political move for Mordecai, as well as being, I'm doing the right thing. Okay, really quickly, a couple of lessons that we can gain from this. What does the chapter reveal about how God works with his people to accomplish his goals?
He's always working behind the scenes.
Yes. Yeah, God's behind the scenes even if it's not obvious to us. Right? He's always working. And we said, too, that he works with people who are willing to do his will. Right? Both Esther and Mordecai have revealed that they want to do the right things. They want to do godly things. And so God is using them because they're willing. Right? Okay. Is there anything in the chapter that reminds you of the gospel or how we relate to Jesus? Now this may take a little thinking. Think about it this way. Ephesians 5:25-27, we often read this section to talk about how husbands and wives should interact. But it also tells us something about Jesus and his bride. It says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So we saw the people, or we saw all these young women being sanctified, right? being cleansed, being washed, the oils were applied. They were made to be the most presentable they could be when they went to see the king, right? Jesus, our king, has done that for us, has he not? He has washed us. He has sanctified us. He is making us presentable to be his bride. And we know, that he is going to return and is essentially returning to take us to be with him forever, right? So this time that we are here on earth as his followers is meant to be a time of us being kind of improving and becoming more and more like him, right? And becoming presentable to him. But the beauty of the gospel is he's doing all that for us, right? It's not something that we can somehow earn or figure out or perfect. But he's doing that for us. But just like Esther, we need to be willing to be part of that. That makes sense? Yeah.
And it's the concept of submission in general.
Yeah.
In her case, she's the wife in submission to her husband, in the same way that we as the church are submissive to Christ.
Exactly, yeah. We're submissive to Christ just like Esther became submissive to her. And even though, again, this was a process that we don't approve of, this harem process, but yet we could see from it kind of an example of what Jesus is doing for us. But in the difference is, no one gets cast aside to be just among a group of concubines in Jesus' kingdom, right? In Jesus' kingdom, we all get to be with him. And that's the beauty of it. All right, we've reached the end of our time. Thank you all very much. Next week we will be in chapter 3, so read ahead. Al? I think they're doing okay. Yeah, yes. How's Mike? I think he's doing okay. Mike, if you're watching, give us a high sign.
He's doing well enough to tell you that he's not wearing a tie next week.
He's not wearing, oh, so he noticed the tie. This is the once-a-year Christmas tie, by the way, so. So that's a good sign. So it sounds like Mike is thinking he'll be ready to come back and teach chapter 3 next week, which I'm happy to hear. So good. He doesn't have to wait 21 days like you do in the Big Ten. So, all right. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your time.